Welcome, everybody. That's a great old track from Gangstar, Guru of blessed memory. The moment of truth. And today we're going to be looking at moments of truth, moments of doom, and moments of kindness, and little moments here and there. So that's the song choice. Hi, everybody. I'm in Montana. I'm trying to capitalize on the last phase of this process, this pandemic process, where we can work from anywhere. And I'm working this week from Montana. And I wish I could show you. I can show you. Let me show you the view here. Check this out. You see that? Yeah. That's pretty nice. All right. So Torah from everywhere, and I know we have Torah students here from all over the world. Nice to see people I haven't seen in a while. Hi, Rachel. Randy's calling in from Japan. Yeah. So here we are, meeting in the space of Torah. Okay. So this is the last session in a 5-part series, and I don't know if anyone is keeping track of that but me, but let me tell you my logic for how we moved through these 5 weeks. We're in the period between Passover and Shavuot. Shavuot is coming up. We have online and in-person options for Shavuot, so check that out on our website. But in that period, the custom is to study Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, and that's the ethical treatise in the Mishnah. This is a Mishnah class. We always study Mishnah together on Monday, and next week, well, not next week because it'll be Shavuot, but 2 weeks from now we'll just go back to our regular cycle through the Mishnah. But it made sense to take this time to study Pirkei Avot, to study ethics, and that's a deep idea that the way that we prepare for encounter with God, revelation, Torah, is to work on ourselves ethically, to really begin to ask the question, what does it mean to be a good person? And as we've done in this series, we can push back even on the question, is there such a thing as a good person? But that's the realm of discussion that we're in. And what I thought would be fun and interesting is Pirkei Avot has been studied and commented on so much, so more than any other tractate of the Mishnah, and so it opens itself up to all kinds of styles of interpretation. And the style that we're looking at in these 5 sessions is what I call the mystical approach to Pirkei Avot, but that's because we're looking at the great Hasidic teachers and masters of the 18th and 19th century. And we took a look just as a bit of review at Rabbi Nachman in the first class, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, and his famous teaching that we have to look for the good in everybody, and then, most importantly, even in ourselves. And then we moved to look at the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, and his theory, a different kind of conception of the self, which is that we are all, most of us are average, neither good nor bad. And we're, those terms are helpful in shaping our behavior, but in the end, we could never be a perfectly righteous or a perfectly wicked person. So those are the first 2. And then we actually took a look at the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut, of this spiritual movement, and started to think about what it means to develop oneself, to work on oneself. And the Baal Shem Tov in particular was concerned with maintaining focus in particular on God. And we looked at a very radical teaching where he suggested that your studies and in your Torah study can actually distract you from your focus on other kinds of spiritual development, because you can start to think that you're so great because you know so much, right? So that's a classic teaching, and that's the founder of Chassidut. And then last week we looked at the Piazetzner Rebbe, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, who spoke about spiritual development, and and encouraged us to start as early as we can in that process. So we thought about like what it means to think about God and spirituality young, and I think for most of us what it means to try and do so starting in the middle of life. So that's like where we've been, and we've been looking at the basic themes of good and evil and how one becomes good or evil, right? That's the overarching ethical question. But the particular flavor or approach that the Hasidic masters have taken, I hope you've noticed if you've been following, it's a lot about perception. It's a lot about cultivating the consciousness, and self-perception and perception of the other is critical. It isn't just about behavior, but the cultivation of the mind, of the heart, of the sensory organs. And we've been looking also at the themes of spiritual development and spiritual discipline, and what it means to have a spiritual discipline. Okay, so it has been, I hope you have felt that it has been a particularly, this is an overused word, but a particularly spiritual approach to these ethical teachings, a particularly like kind of God-centered approach to these ethical teachings. But I would also say that there's been nothing particularly mystical about it. I mean, you know, I guess all spiritual concepts are mystical in a certain. God is a mystical concept. What is that even? It's mysterious. But we haven't been dealing with esoteric mysticism. Like, wow, these are secret codes. They don't make any sense. There's a mystery here. There's secret knowledge here. And today we're going to do a little bit of that. I hope we've created a space that now allows us to take a little bit of a risk. This isn't straightforward stuff, and I'm not sure exactly where we're going. We're going to look at some wild and weird ideas and try to see if we can extract something practical, meaningful, useful for us in our lives as we continue to prepare for this moment of revelation. Okay, so that's just an intro for this final session. Let's say a blessing over our Torah study today. Last night we counted the 43rd day of the Omer. So we're getting there, about a week to go. And let's say a blessing over our Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here we go. I said we're gonna get mystical, right? This has all been the ethics of the mystics. So we're gonna get particularly mystical today. And in part, the reason that we have to is that the Mishnah that we're gonna look at. So we've been doing this every time. We look at one Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, and then we use it as a kind of a jumping off point to head into the thought of a particular Hasidic master. And the Mishnah that we're going to look at today itself is, we don't need to even get to the mystics. The Mishnah itself is very strange and hard to read, and I would say, you know, mysterious, if not mystical. And it comes in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot. Right, we've done this 5 times now. 5th chapter, which is really the last chapter of Pirkei Avot. There was one added much later, but the 5th chapter is really the last chapter, and it's a unique chapter. It has like the 10 things that were done for our ancestors, and the 10 kinds of righteous people in the world, and the 10 things that were created in the eve of the first Shabbat. That was like, and then the 4 this and the 4 this, and there's a lot of numerology. So that already starts to feel a little like Jewish mysticism, which is very concerned with numbers and letters and the play of those forces in the world. Okay, so in the middle of this chapter is the following Mishnah. Let me give you the source sheet so you can look at it on your own. But just the gist of it is a comparison between Abraham and Bilum. Abraham, you probably have heard of. Bilum, you may not have, but he's a cool character, or he's an interesting character. We just started the book of Numbers this week, and Bilum appears in the book of Numbers, and I think it's fair to say it's the weirdest parsha in the Torah, weirdest reading in the Torah, just because the story of the Torah stops. We're like moving through the desert, and all of a sudden there's this, it's like, it's all about us, right? It's our story, leaving Egypt, going through the desert. All of a sudden there's like a pause, and we go to a different story, and the Torah tells the story of a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, a non-Israelite prophet, to use the term of that day, who is nevertheless seems to have power because Balak, the parsha actually named for Balak, the king of Moab, tries to hire Bilum, because he has these mystical powers, right, to use that word again, to curse Israel. So it is about us, but it's about us, like it looks at us from the outside, from the perspective of a king who is our enemy, and then a prophet who is being hired to curse us. Now, the only other thing that I want to say before we head in is that Bilum's holds a funny place in our tradition, because if you read the Torah, he really doesn't seem like such a bad guy. In fact, like he seems like a good guy. He is connected to God, to our God, to the God that we talk about all the time, right? The Adonai God. And he says things all the time that reaffirm that connection. And remember, he's being hired to curse us, but in fact, he doesn't end up doing it. In fact, in the end, he blesses us because he says things like this. So here's an example of thing that we hear from Bilum. He took up his theme and said, "From Aram has Balak brought me," that's that king, Moab's king from the hills of the east. "Come, curse me, Jacob. Come, tell Israel's doom." But he says, "How can I damn whom God has not damned? How can I doom when the Eternal has not doomed?" Okay, that sounds good. Sounds like, it's like, that's Joseph language. I can't do it. Only God has the power, and I have no power on my own. So it sounds like a sympathetic character from the plain reading of the Torah. But the rabbis hate Bilum. They hate him. They hate him. And everything that the rabbis teach about Bilum it's Bilum HaRasha, Bilum the wicked. In fact, the most colorful teaching suggests that Bilum, who famously rode on his donkey to go curse Israel, the rabbis teach that, yeah, he rode on his donkey, wink, wink, like he also slept with his donkey along the way. I mean, it's like, it's pretty low level, but like, that's as dirty as it gets for the rabbis, you know? If they say you sleep with your donkey, like they really hate you. So they really hate Bilum, and we're gonna see that in this Mishnah right away. But first of all, as I said, I'm not entirely clear why they hate Bilum so much. So that's one of the questions that's like hovering above this conversation. But they're also very interested in drawing a comparison between Bilum and Abraham. Okay, so here's the Mishnah that we're going to look at. Right up here at the top. And we're going to take some time to just try to understand this, because I said the Mishnah here is just, it's weird on its own without any help from the mystics. Okay, so here's the Mishnah. Whoever possesses these three things is of the disciples of our father Abraham. And whoever possesses three other things is one of the disciples of Bilum the wicked. Language in Hebrew is kol mi sheyesh biyado shlosha devarim. Anyone who has in his hand three things, these three things, they're one of the students of Abraham, and three other things are one of the students of Bilum. And I chose disciples because they, not really studying with them, but the language in Hebrew is talmidav, the students. Okay, here are the three things. Ain tova, a good eye. Veruach nemucha, a humble spirit or a lowly spirit. And this is the most difficult to translate. V'nefesh shvala, a moderate appetite, is the translation that Safaria had here, and I stuck with it because it's a little hard to distinguish between the humble spirit and the nefesh shvala. I might have translated that as humble spirit, but the commentators tend to see the nefesh as some sort of force of appetite, like part of our soul that desires. So a force of appetite. So the translation, if you're following in the Hebrew, is a little funky here, but I think it's the best we can do. A good eye, a humble spirit, and a moderate appetite makes one a disciple of Abraham, our father. An evil eye, a haughty spirit, and a limitless appetite. So just the opposite. Ayin ra'ah, v'ruach gvoha, v'nefesh rachava, makes one a disciple of Bilum the wicked. Okay, so this is going to be, in some ways, this is the core of our teaching, right? Have a good eye, a humble spirit, and a moderate appetite, and not an evil eye, a haughty spirit, and a limitless appetite. Though those terms themselves are not easy to define. I mean, just the first one, what is a good eye? I mean, we probably know the kind of folk idea of an evil eye, casting an evil eye, right? Ayin ra. But what is that, and what's a good eye? Okay, just before I open it up for your interpretation, let me just show you that the Mishnah here gets even weirder. Okay, so first of all, why are we comparing Abraham and Bilum? Why are these the two? I mean, I know Abraham, but Bilum, why is he being propped up as the anti-Abraham? Why are these the three traits that define being one of Abraham's disciples and being one of Bilum's disciples? The English translation is always Balaam, but in Hebrew we say Bilum. So I'll keep it as Bilum. Okay. So just one more thing, and then I know I've been talking a long time, so I'm going to open it up. And what is the difference between the disciples of our father Abraham and the disciples of Bilum the wicked? So, okay, so now we've set up this dichotomy. What's the difference? The disciples of our father Abraham enjoy this world and then inherit the world to come. As it is said, I will endow those who love me with substance, and I will fill their treasuries. That seems to mean I will give you stuff in this world, and then I will fill your treasuries, your storehouses for the world to come. We don't need to worry so much about the proof text, but this language is common language for the rabbis. There's this world, and then there's the world to come, olam haba. And nobody really knows what the world to come is, okay? Like, if anyone ever asks you, like, what's the Jewish conception of the afterlife? Just say, like, you don't know, nobody knows. Olam haba is the word for it, but is that the world that will be in the future, or is it some other spiritual realm? Is it the reward you get in the afterlife? It's not entirely clear. But the point is, Abraham, the students of Abraham get stuff in this world and then in the world to come. Whereas the disciples of Bilum the wicked inherit Gehenna, which is the closest word or concept we have to hell, and descend into the nethermost pit. As it is said, another proof text, for you, O God, will bring them down to the nethermost pit, those murderous and treacherous men. They shall not live out half their days, but I trust in you. Okay, this is a Mishnah. What we just read is a Mishnah. You know, like if you've been studying Mishnah with us now for a year, you know it's mostly these laws, very kind of practical little teachings. And yes, in this volume, we're studying ethics, but still, it's all very kind of straightforward. Be humble, be a good person, strive to do right. These are the basic teaching. Now, you're either a student of Abraham or a student of Bilum the wicked, that foreign prophet, and you manifest that by having either a good eye or a bad eye, either a haughty spirit or a lowly spirit, either a moderate appetite or a voracious appetite. And then you should also know that the separation, the distinction between those two classes is the Abrahamites who inherit the world to come and the Bilum people who go to hell, basically, okay? I mean, I'm already lost. I hope you're lost too. Or I hope you're not. Maybe you can help me. Let's start a little bit by thinking about what's this comparison about? Why are we comparing these two figures? And what are the things that distinguish them? What are those traits? Why is this? Can anyone want to take a first pass at making some sense of this? Of this Mishnah and its good and bad poles here. Alexandra.
So I have kind of a cynical view of the rabbis, but my guess, without and this is, I haven't read the Parsha directly recently about Bilum, but they needed to, because of all the trauma that they were steeped in, preserve a religion. So to set up someone who is a prophet outside of Judaism as the bad guy serves the need at the time to preserve the religion, to preserve, yeah. So I think that might at least contribute to them seeing him as a bad person, or at least speaking about him as a bad person, which I can understand. And also, I don't think is necessarily accurate to his character. But what I particularly like in the comparison, whether or not that belongs to the various disciples of the two or not, is the contrast between ayin hara and a good eye. And that I think it is important to recognize that we do have the power to energetically diminish others with our thoughts, with our envy, with our judgments. And that we also have the power, which is less sort of spoken about or thought about, I think, in at least in my understanding, that we also have the power to like uplift others energetically and with our thoughts. And so when we strive to do that, like it comes back to us. And then when we sort of are careless and are energetically diminishing of others with our thoughts, with our envy, it comes back to us.
Okay.
So that's, yeah.
No, I mean, you just did so much excellent work for us. I just want to underline some of the pieces that you just gave us. I think that's exactly, first of all, your answer to the question of why the comparison, I think, is exactly right, or at least is the most, I think the most immediate answer that we would come to is why do the rabbis hate Bilum so much? Why are they saying that he sleeps with his donkey? Like, why go there? And I think that you're exactly right, that they have this discomfort with the fact that the Torah has another prophet that talks to God outside of Israel. Like, what? There's just some other guy who's just like Moses, and he's just hanging out on the outskirts of Moab, and he has power, and he could use that power, and it's the power of God, and he could use that power against us. That's just it's freaky to the rabbi. They don't like the idea that there just be many prophets out there, and who knows, and sometimes they have good days. So this must be an anti-prophet, a wicked prophet, a bad prophet. And so I think that anxiety that you're naming is exactly right. And I wanted to just thank you, Alexander, for giving us the language that is going to, I think, be very helpful to us in this conversation about both of these characters representing some kind of ability that we have to affect the world with our energy. And that's a good word, because it's we know the word, but it's also a little vague, and we're in a little bit of a vague realm. Like, we're talking about people who they could call out into the world. They could set their intentions into the world, and that would have an effect, right? The idea of Bilum is that if he curses you, you will be cursed. And if he blesses you, you will be blessed. He has that power, right? And Abraham has that power too, right? And here I want to just add an important piece to what Alexander just said. Remember, Bilum is being shuffled around to try and curse the people of Israel, right? I think that if we're thinking like Alexandra is about the power that these people have to affect the world, then the obvious place we want to draw a comparison is to Abraham praying for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Because Abraham also seems to have some power to try and stop God from hurting these people. Okay, so there's you can see they're both working. And by the way, does Bilum end up cursing Israel? Is he successful? No. Does Abraham end up saving Sodom and Gomorrah? Is he successful? No. So it's like there's some complicated dynamics with this energy that they put out, and it isn't straightforward that they're going to get what they're seeking. Okay, let me keep moving. Yonatan.
I think the great point of similarity between Bilum and Abraham is that they both have direct access to God in a society where they're the only ones who do, and that they didn't learn from anyone, right? They intuited, they worked on it, whatever it is, however they got that direct line to God. That's where the similarity ends. It's the Harry Potter Voldemort dichotomy, right? It's like our abilities and our choices. And they make very different choices. And I actually disagree with you, no surprise, that the Torah shows Bilum as exclusively a sympathetic character. I mean, one of the things we do know about him is that he basically recruited the Midianite women to try to get the Israelite men to veer into idolatry, right? And I think really the difference that the rabbis are trying to convey to us is when you have power, how do you use it, right? Do you use it in a way that's narrow and self-serving and self-important, or do you use it in a way that's expansive and virtuous and maybe in the common interest? I think is really what this mission is trying to tell us.
Great. Thank you for that. And that's an important, that perspective is important for thinking about what is the case the rabbis are making against Bilum? And Yonatan's exactly right. There is a case to be made, because on the one hand, he says things like, well, it's only God. I have to follow God. But on the other hand, he is willing to try and curse, like to curse for hire. And he spends a lot of that parsha like moving around, trying to figure out he moves to different locations. And it seems like if he can catch us in some act of sin, then he'll be able, there's something, like if he can get us in a certain state, he'll be able to curse us. He has to be working with God, but he's looking for, and this will be very important for once we head into the commentaries here, he's looking for an opening, a window here that will allow him to curse. So he's not successful. And maybe he even like talks a big game about his fidelity to God, but he's trying to do some bad in the world. And that is important, right? That's an important thing to remember about Bilum. Marianka.
So it's more of a question that I have, but I wonder if there's something about the donkey, which, by the way, is the donkey there is a metaphor of stubbornness, but it's the donkey that hears God, right, and acts. And also I was thinking that isn't there, and I'm not sure, but isn't there this idea that in the future, the Messiah is going to come on a donkey, right? So he's kind of like the opposite of that.
Yeah,
through the donkey,
great.
like the figure coming on a donkey, not listening to what the donkey's hearing, and donkey's acting by being stubborn, and he's kicking the donkey and beating the donkey, right? Like there's something about that figure on the donkey for me.
No, you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right. And Marianka begins to open up for us this comparison between Abraham and Bilum, and to show that it's not just the rabbis who are trying to draw this link. There's stuff going on in the Torah itself. We don't have time to do all of the comparisons today, but the donkey is exactly right. Abraham and Bilum wake up in the morning, saddle their donkey, and head out on their mission, right? That's language we see in Abraham. And actually, once we start to read the Bilum story, we'll see all kinds of Abraham language. And maybe the most striking thing, they both come from the same place, Aram Naharaim. So it's as if like, this is the town where prophets are born, and they can go either way, right? So lots of comparison. And in fact, even the line that we looked at a little bit earlier, how can I curse the one that God has not cursed? How can I damn whom God has not damned? How can I doom when the Eternal has not doomed? That very language is kind of Abraham language. I will bless those who bless you and curse him that curses you, right? There's something like the Torah is doing it. That I feel sure of. and we could do textual analysis, but Marianka brings out one really obvious comparison, that they both are sort of, there aren't that many donkeys in the Torah, right? As Rabbi B'nai Lapi sometimes says, right? There's only so many donkey stories in the Torah. So, okay, great. So we're almost ready to head in and to start looking at how the Hasidic masters are going to like think about this comparison. But what's still, we're doing good work, but we still haven't really totally untangled this Mishnah, because there's Alexander was talking about this, the good eye and the bad eye. That seems, maybe that's related to their ability to, I'm casting an evil eye on you, or I'm casting a good eye on you. So, and then there's like are they lowly of spirit, or are they haughty of spirit? And there's the appetite, that stuff. And then there's all this talk about the afterlife, the afterworld, the things that you will get that are not in this realm. And we'll get stuff in this realm, but then there's like the after. So that's also like that's also in the mix here. And it's a confusing teaching. Let's take one more comment, and then we're going to take a look at the Hasidic commentaries. Matt Silberstein.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat. I have two things to say. One, Bilum seems to be a real person. We have external evidence of stories about Bilum, and a story about Bilum dealing with El, and so he's one of the few characters that we have external stuff about him. And I think that's kind of why what we get is a positive story about him that is then made worse and worse and worse with rewriting. Because this isn't the only time Bilum is in the Torah, and all the other ones, he's just bad, like the story that Yonatan told. But the thing that gets me, I've never understood the evil eye. I've never understood what people are saying when they say about the evil eye, because all I can get is dualism again, that there's a bad God and a good God, or a bad power and a good power. So I can see if you've got Bilum and you have to put him down, connecting him to the evil eye. But I really never understood what people mean. The evil eye will avoid you. What's going on there?
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's okay. Good. That's part of what we're going to try and think about here. Is there is the very idea of casting an evil eye is a mystical notion. There are powers, and I can summon them. And as Matt says, it starts to get complicated, because once there are different powers, dark forces and good forces, and then it's like, wait, is this from God, or are there evil forces in the world? What does it mean that you could manipulate the spiritual powers of the world for good or evil? Like, why would that even possible if God is good? So okay, so now we're ready. We're heading into a realm of thinking about, this is really like mystical thought, thinking about how we manipulate the forces of the universe to create good or evil. So we're going to go there, but don't worry, there's also going to be some more practical implications. But let's head in, and the last of our Hasidic masters that we're looking at, the figure that we're going to take a look at today, is the Sfas Emes, or the Sfat Emet. And the Sfas Emes was, this is a very modern figure. In fact, he died in 1905, so really entered into the 20th century, and was one of the great rabbis of the Ger Hasidim. Ger was a town in Poland. And what can I say about the Sfas Emes? He is beloved and also dismissed. Okay, he's beloved because he's probably the most beautiful writer of the Hasidic masters. It's just pure poetry, a little like Heschel in that way. Just like every line is just like a turning over of a word and an idea and the implications of it's the richest linguistic kind of poetic analysis of verses, and but it's so poetic that sometimes it is accused of just being fluff, as Heschel is sometimes as well. It's just like, these are beautiful thoughts that you're just sort of spinning out, but are you really saying anything? And I think that sort of introduction to the Sfas Emes is is the one I want you to have, because I want you to decide, he's going to give us a system here, and it's like, I find the images that he's using here so intriguing. And I titled this class, The Moment of Doom and the Thread of Kindness. And those are both phrases that he's going to use, but like, what does that mean? I'm still not sure. And I, studied this, for hours now preparing for this class. So let's try to figure out what these concepts are. He's going to be making sense of our Mishnah, but then offering us some new ideas, which I think are worthy of our consideration. And we'll see if we can make some kind of takeaway of them. All right, so let's take a look here. The Sfas Emes of Poland, one of the great Hasidic masters, though it is a matter of taste. Okay, in the Mishnah, says the Sfas Emes, it says, whoever possesses these three things is one of the disciples of our father Abraham, peace be upon him, and if three other things, a student of Bilum the wicked. Okay. Our sages, he says, are revealing to us that this wicked one is the exact opposite from the righteousness of our father Abraham, peace be upon him. Okay, so he just, in some ways, this is just the obvious, but he's saying this setup here, this dichotomy, Abraham and Bilum, means there's something, they're not just good and bad, they're polar opposites. They're the inverse of one another, okay? And this language of the opposite or the inverse kind of dynamics is going to be important as he continues. Okay, now he's going to talk about what it means for the wicked to try and curse the righteous. Okay, so here he's going to explain by giving us a little bit of a kind of a proof text. And he's going to use the proof text to speak about this idea of the moment of doom. Okay, so this is Bilum. I think I'll just say that. He's describing Bilum here. The idea can be understood through another teaching of the sages on the verse, how can I damn when God has not damned? How can I doom when the eternal has not doomed? Okay, we read that. That's the line we looked at. And Bilum says that. And here's his understanding of this. Because the wicked one is looking for that one moment of God's doom. All right? Mechaven rega za'amo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Looking for just that moment of God's doom. And that language, he's right, the sages do talk about a moment of doom. And this is how the sages always use verses to prove their point. So this is how they do it. Let's see if you can understand the proof, okay? There's a little proof in here. It is written, God pronounces doom every day. Ooh, that's not good. It says that in the Psalms. God pronounces doom every day. Ve'el zoem b'chol yom. But how long is God's doom? Just a moment. Why? How do you know that it's just, okay, so there's doom every day. But how long is it? Just a moment. How do you know? Because it's also written that God's kindness is all day long. You get the proof text here. God pronounces doom every day, but God's kindness is all day long. So you see how that means that there's only one moment of doom? Understand that? It's just like every day versus all day. So every day there is doom, but kindness actually takes up all day. So if there's doom every day, it must just be a second. Okay, that's like rabbinic, play with the verses. That's like classic. That's the way the sages make their points. Okay, so through these verses, they proved that there's a moment of doom every day. But of course, for us, the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean that there's one moment of doom every day? We're certainly in mystical thought here. All day is kindness, and yet there's a moment of doom. And here's his point. What is the wicked one up to? The wicked one is the goal, he says, magama. The goal of the wicked is to find that moment of doom. The goal of the wicked is to find that moment of doom. But the righteous are looking to find the time of favor, as it is written. And here's a famous line. And as for me, vani tfilati, let my prayer come to you at a time of favor. Eit ratzon. Here's the Hebrew, a time of favor. Okay, so I think now we're we're well into like a mystical scheme of the world. So let's just see if any of us understand it. I certainly don't. What would it mean to say that there are times of favor and then also moments of doom, right? So these times are present in the world, and the wicked, I mean, imagine they're like I don't know what they're doing. They're like charting the stars or something, but they're like, there it is, a moment of doom. I got it. Okay, so that's quite a scheme. What do you make of it, Payam?
I understand what he's saying. I think the way it's said makes it a lot more confusing because he's using time. For me, it's causation versus correlation, right? So a wicked person sees wickedness and infers causation when it's just correlation, right? Like a fire truck drives by your house and something happens, right? The fire truck doesn't cause that event, but the wicked person is doing the same thing for God. That any wicked thing that happens in the world is immediately the power of God, even though, it's just it could be correlation. But the wise person is always looking for the actual causation of things in the world.
That's really interesting. And Payam's doing some good work at making what is at first mystical, making it feel a little more philosophical or psychological. And I invite you all to do some of that same work. But Payam's version is that what does it mean to seek the moment of doom or to look for the moment of doom is to interpret the world, to see that the world is happening and you can point to something and say, the world is wicked. There are wicked forces in the world. Something bad happens, you make connections, and they're not necessarily, that isn't necessarily the explanation, but you make attributions that suggest that the world is, there's a streak of wickedness in the world, right? And then I suppose the righteous would do the opposite. They would be looking to see the world and its movements and forces as fundamentally good. Okay, that's one good take on it. Who else? Jonathan?
To me, he's saying something really radical and counterintuitive, which is that it's easier to be kind than to be wicked. If what you're trying to do is find the time when God is merciful, then that's, you've got that 24 hours a day minus one moment, right? And if you're trying to find the time when God is, thinking doom, you have to work really, really hard to be able to find that time. And it's like he's saying that the nature of the world is kindness, and the nature of the world is for God to be kind, and anything else is a deviation.
That's right. That's very good. So, and that helps us understand, I think, how he and maybe the rabbis are reading the Abraham and Bilum stories. In other words, part of what he's saying is, when Abraham and Bilum, they look to the heavens or they look to God, they ask for what they're dealing with. Abraham is looking up at a spiritual reality that is mostly good, right? And it's easier to be good because the world is fundamentally good and the spiritual forces of the world are fundamentally good. Whereas Bilum looks at the world and sees or looks at God or looks at the spiritual realm and sees the good, but sees also elements. Payam would say interprets elements, but in the simple reading, there's little moments. I mean, God in our tradition does curse and doom and rage and right. So, but that's not the rabbis or the Sfas Emes who wants to believe the fundamental reality. But there are blips of it. And a wicked person can capitalize on those blips, okay? Dejas, what do you think?
I think that it has to do with narrative arc, and that the nature of our eyes, our vision is always partial, right? Like an ass, like the donkey. Even a donkey has to turn his head to see his own ass. So with this limited angle that we have, if we focus on the limitation of it, then yes, as Payam was saying, we're able to kind of fractalize our attention to the little bit, the moment of pain in every day, the moment of fasting in every day, the moment of joy. It becomes pixelated or pointillated. But when we put our faith in or invest our the power of our cognition in the longer arc, the inclusive arc, the ayin that can encompass the little bits, then we're entering into that righteous mentality that sees, oh, yes, I may have a beginning and middle and end personally, but it's part of a much broader narrative. I'm part of this broader, I'm a tiny wave in this big ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking as you're describing this, like, the question might be, how do you read the world? What is the narrative that you read into the world? And how do you make sense of the great scheme of things? And if you have an overarching narrative that is fundamentally good, then you will see bad things happen, but you can, or maybe even to you, but you can kind of read them into the bigger picture. You can see them in their context, right? Whereas there is the possibility of focusing on the bad and because of the bad, reading the world as a fundamentally bad place from a kind of God perspective. Now, I want to do one more thing because we're already coming to the end of our hour, and there's actually a major twist, and we've set it up nicely here because I think the language that we've been hearing from Dejas, from Yonatan, from Payam, this idea of looking at the world and reading it a certain way, but really what they're looking at is the God world, the spiritual realm, the kind of unique relationships that people like Abraham and Bilum have to communing with the forces of power and divinity. But look at what he says now. Like in a kind of a quick phrase, he flips the whole thing, because now he starts to talk about, okay, that's true in that realm, but what's it like down here? And it's just the opposite. Remember, he was working in these opposite schemes. So take a look now. And just one more phrase I want to offer before we look at this, which is that the idea that he's been training us here with so far is that there is a reality, a fundamental reality, and then there are blips in the middle, and you can either look at the whole or you can search for the blips. Okay, now look at how that works on here in our world, in the lower realm. So the righteous, if you will recall, they were looking to find the time of favor, and this is a classic phrasing, right? The rabbis of the Talmud talked about, like, beseeching God at a moment of favor. That's like a classical theological concept, okay? But Sfas Emes has given it a certain spin, right? There are moments of doom and general times of favor. And what's more, he says, here's the flip. They, the righteous, are also able to find the thread of kindness in this world. For this world is just the opposite. Adarabah, it runs on judgment. Judgment is a severe word, and I almost translated Dina as doom, just to keep the parallelism, but it's not exactly the same word, judgment. This world runs on judgment, or may I say, this world runs on doom, but every day there is a thread of kindness. And the goal of the righteous is to find that small point of kindness and good favor. So now, isn't that interesting? Like, what do you do with this worldview where the spiritual realm is fundamentally good, though there are those wicked prophets who are trying to seize a moment of doom out of it. But here in this reality, it's actually mostly bad. And the goal of the righteous is to find that thread of kindness. What does that mean? Anyone have a read on that? I want to turn to Jen, who had her hand up from before, so no need to answer this question.
Well, actually was sort of heading in that direction, so it works well. One of the most helpful things that anyone ever told me in terms of spiritual advice was that when something horrible happens to you, you can dwell for a little while on why me, but then you have to move to what now. And I feel like a parallel here where you can look at the difficulties and the doom and the judgment and all of the flaws and the times that it feels like God is, judging you or persecuting you or throwing bad things at you, and get lost in that. Or you can get past that and go to, how do I still live in the world knowing that this doom exists and could be down the road at any point or was just given to me? How do I live in the world with joy? And how do I live in the world with kindness? And how do I make meaning of being in a world that has these moments of doom? And that's the way to get through when you have something really horrible happen to you or when you're expecting it to happen.
Good, good, excellent. I love that. I love that reading. And that's right. There seems, in this whole system, there seems to be a kind of sifting process. You're searching, and again, it's like they just said, it's like reading the world in a certain way. What are the choices I make for how to interpret my reality? And sometimes I have to search for the way to have a good read on it, because my reality seems horrible, right? So there's like some process here of really creating your reality selectively, focusing on the themes and the forces that you believe in and that you want for the world. Okay, Kathy.
Well, I was going to say something sort of, similar, that the it seems to me that the idea is not so much that our world is, sort of more bad, and but that it's just our perceptions of things, because it's all about perception, and and somehow it's so much easier to perceive the bad. But what really strikes me too is that this whole business of finding the good, or perceiving the good, is very tied to sort of midot practice, like Musar practice. One of the key elements is it's translated as gratitude, but it's actually hakarat hatov, I think, to notice the good. And I think that's just sort of fundamental. And that once you notice it, then it's almost like it's synonymous with gratitude. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is that, I guess this is a question, is I sort of take it that kind of construct was actually a kind of reaction to a certain extent to the mystics, that it was kind of much more of a rationalistic way of sort of, dealing with. But it seems to me they're both pointing exactly the same place, that noticing the good is like key to everything.
Yeah, and I think, we've been talking about mysticism, right? It's the ethics of the mystics, and I call this the most mystical of our treatments. But I part of what we're doing, which I think is so important and right, is to see mysticism itself as a kind of poetry, a kind of, it's not about the actual system that's being mapped out into the world, but looking at the world in this way in order to cultivate a certain kind of perception, a certain kind of relationship to your reality. And as Kathy said, and as so many of us have been saying, the idea here is that you create your reality. You create your perception of reality. And I don't know what that means for people like Abraham and Bilum, who create a reality that is so powerful that they can actually, according to our tradition, somehow summon the forces of good or evil into the world. But certainly on the human, on the us level, it certainly seems that, yeah, of course, we are constantly looking for those moments of goodness, kindness, inspiration, something to give me. I mean, what a year, what a 5 years we've been through. The world is crap. This is a horrible world, right? And I know a lot of people feel that way. It's work to try and find that goodness, find that kindness, try to like construct a reality in against the data, right? And the Svasanas is sort of having it both ways, right? Because is the data that the world is fundamentally good or bad? Well, it's fundamentally good in this heavenly realm, though there's bad there, and it's fundamentally bad here, though there's good here. But it's like that leaves us just like sifting and looking for, how do we interpret, how do we make sense of this reality? Okay, Agnes, and then if we have time, Hannah as well.
I guess
Agnes?
this is maybe a small thing, but just that I'm noticing the images throughout our nefesh, ruach, like wind, breath, and eyes, which are all things that I think you can either see as being like very forceful and substantial, or things that are very empty and sort of like seeing as a neutral vessel for something else that moves through, or like wind and breath as emptiness, like vanity. And there's this anxiety about whether these things have substance or force in the world, or whether they are just empty and sort of like pass through our lives without leaving any trace. And I think that it feels like the emotional reality that all this is in conversation with is a feeling of vulnerability and like a feeling of fear that the things that we see and the things that we say and the things that we discern in the world around us are just wind as emptiness, or just nothing. And that's why I feel like that image of a thread just on that level is so powerful, because a thread is both incredibly material. It's not just saying like your interpretation, it's saying this is an actual substantial thing. And it's very vulnerable. A thread is like very precarious, but there's also all those images in the tradition of like the threefold cord and like threads as being a thing that's becomes tough. And I guess I'm just saying that the imagery is so interesting to me, and that dance between like, is this substantial or is it empty? And it reflects that emotional experience of vulnerability that feels like what's behind a lot of this question.
Oh, that is such beautiful work you're doing there, Agnes. And because remember, we have these three things: the eye, the spirit, the soul. And I just love the way you're with such nuance, pointing out that those are run the intangible spirit, your soul, like what your whole experience of reality in some ways comes down to these very subtle and kind of intangible things, the thread being somehow hovering in between. So that's very helpful. Why these things? Because they're the things upon which everything hinges, but they're kind of nothing at all. It's all about your perspective. Yeah. Hannah, just a minute left, but I'd love to hear
I should have gone before Agnes, because I have a really superficial tiny thing to say. So let's pretend Agnes spoke after me. But I just want to go back to the beginning and connecting Bilum and Abraham. And I keep thinking about the fact that they both are known as being part of the stories we know from both of them are tent stories. Because we know with Abraham that he comes out of his tent to greet these people right after he's circumcised, and he welcomes them. And it's really this story of like how he is as a host, as a welcomer, as a forefather for all of us. And then with Bilum, we have him. He's the one who says, Ma tavu alecha Yaakov. He's the one who acknowledges the goodness of these tents of this welcoming. And I don't have any ideas. I don't have any answers about any of it, but it's such a weird detail, and it probably doesn't matter, but I've just been thinking about how they're connected on this weird basic level of the ways we associate imagery with them, which maybe is related to what Agnes is saying about imagery, but what do those represent for us, and how do they recognize them differently? What is Abraham doing in his tent story, in his tent moment, that's different from what Bilum is doing? And how are they making choices that represent differently the people they're going to be as their stories evolve?
Yeah, great. Thank you for bringing us back to that original comparison, because I think that's remember we said at the outset that the rabbis are sort of struggling. Why is there's this other prophet in the world who has God powers and yet might curse us? And I think part of what they're trying to grapple with is some assertion that the Torah seems to be making that, it's not just about who's spiritual and who's not. It's not just about who's religious. Actually, even in that realm, we can have a totally different experience of the world, right? Depending on how we read these symbols, how we use our eyes, how our spirit, we all have spirit, but how does it manifest in the world, right? And I think that's really, really powerful. I mean, I think that in some ways is what we do with Torah, right? We look at Torah, and this can be either like a Bronze Age, barbaric, violent, horrible text that has like a mean, angry God that just sort of like disturbs or it can be the most sacred, holy, inspiring, uplifting document that is meant to bring chesed and kindness and love into the world. But it's about how we read it, right? And we can read it for the good or for the bad. And once we learn to read our Torah for the good, then hopefully we're learning how to read our world towards the good. Okay, and that's part of what I hope we've been doing for these last 5 weeks together, and I hope that we're heading towards the receiving of a Torah of kindness, a Torah of goodness, right? A Torah that affirms, even sometimes, in spite of the data, the fundamental goodness in our reality. And I'll just end, because the language is so beautiful here with the way that the Sfas Emes ends, because so far he's been talking about Abraham and Bilum, but he ends by saying, and this war, right? The good traits are the ones that Abraham tries to manifest. The wicked tries to manifest different traits. And he says, and this war goes on every day. And so each and every soul in Israel must strive to awaken the trait of kindness every day. Every day, there's a war between not good and evil just, but how we see the world. Do we see the world as good, or do we see the world as evil? And we have to try to look for that thread of kindness, even when the world seems to be nothing but doom. So let's go fight the war. No, let's go prepare ourselves for the receiving of a Torah of kindness. Wishing everybody a beautiful rest of your week and a moment of revelation. Right? I hope that we all have a moment of divine revelation this coming Shavuot. All right. Thank you all for your learning. Thank you for joining me these last 5 weeks. Next 2 weeks from now, we're back in the regular old Mishnah, non-mystical Mishnah. Okay. Good to see you.